So I've done several videos in the past about things I grew up with, video games, movies, TV shows. And in this video I'm going to do cars that I grew up with. And these basically were all the cars in my family, both immediate and extended, up until about my first year in high school, I believe. We're going in chronological order of the vehicle, not necessarily the time when I had it exposed to in my life. So, to start off with is a 1978 Chevrolet Caprice Classic. After 40 years, assuming nothing has happened to it, this car is still running, believe it or not. Back when it was new, my granddad toured the entire nation in this car, according to my late father. And I absolutely loved this car. In terms of, strictly from a design standpoint, the spiritual successor to this would be the Ford Crown Victoria. But I absolutely loved these. They were able to seat 6. Very plush, almost sofa-like seating. They don't make cars this big anymore. And one of the interesting quirks about it is it does still run. It takes a little bit to get going, but once it's up and running, it'll keep on going. Until you obviously want it to stop. But the gas tank in this model, which was is placed in a rather strange location, and that is behind the license plate. These days, I don't know of a single car these days that does that. I'm not sure if it's because of regulation or what. But this and one other vehicle that I'm going to show you are the only ones that have the license plate back there, or the fuel tank back there behind the license plate. The trunk was huge. This thing had a big old V8 in it, which it had to given the size. There was a late relative who I never knew personally. My dad knew him, that worked for General Motors as a medic, as a doctor, medical doctor, and that's how the family basically got steep discounts on all General Motors vehicles. So a lot of the older vehicles in the family are basically 100% GM. And as I said, this Caprice Classic is still running after 40 years. One thing I want to note, though, before we continue, these are representations of the vehicles. I tried to get as close to the actual vehicles themselves as I could, but obviously finding the actual vehicles, especially since some of them are no longer in the family, would not be, an easy thing to do. So a couple of interesting quirks. I started to talk about that and then trailed off. I apologize. The clock doesn't work. The speedometer doesn't work. The air conditioning doesn't work. And the windows can be temperamental. Now, due to my recent cataract surgery, I had to forego heading up to my family place this year where the vehicle is kept. So unless something else happened that I don't know about, that's basically all that's wrong with it. Unless, like I said, unless something else suddenly decided to stop working. Now, the speedometer not working is an interesting one because you kind of have to judge your speed relative to everybody else, and thankfully not a single person that I know of has gotten stopped in this thing. Another really, really old GM vehicle in the family was a 1980 Buick Electra. This was owned by my cousins, and the interesting thing about this one is not only did it have the license plate in the back, like the old Chevy, this had a bit of a problem where the engine literally would not shut off. That was towards the end of its life, but it was one of the more memorable things about that car. It was, this example is nowhere near accurate representation. It was the same model year. It was an Electra Limited, but the one that the family had was sky blue with a navy blue interior, very much the same as the Caprice as far as accommodation, very plush seating for six, just a really extravagant vehicle by today's standards, I think. The closest, if you wanted something like this, number one, you can't get bench seating anymore. They just don't do it anymore. And as far as the quality of the seats, the closest thing you'd be able to get, I think, would probably be something along the lines of a Cadillac or a BMW or an Audi or something. And even then, because like I said, the seating in these old cars was basically that of a home couch. Okay, so it was very plush, very comfortable, which made sense for the target market, which was the basically the baby boomer generation. Switching things over a little bit to Chrysler, my grandfather on my mother's side of the family had a 1988, or not 85, excuse me, 1985 Dodge Diplomat. Now, I don't remember too much about this car, so there's no way I'd be able to get you an accurate representation of that in terms of the actual model that he had. But the one thing I remember was he had it equipped, it was basically the top of the line model at the time, and he had it equipped with this talking computer, and it literally said, "Your door is ajar." Seriously, it said, "Your door is ajar." And it kept saying that until you slammed the door and it said, "Thank you." That was one of the trademarks, I think, of these vehicles. I believe the sibling to the Dodge Diplomat, was the Chrysler LeBaron. Don't quote me on that, okay? Because these really old cars, aside from that old Chevy that I showed you, and a couple other 80s cars that I have very recent memories of. This one I don't, because I think he must have gotten rid of it when I was still very young. I don't really remember. All I remember is that crazy talking computer. That was just weird. Excuse me. My uncle had a 1985 Jeep Cherokee, and his Jeep was basic. All it had in terms of amenities was all-wheel drive, which was really all he needed. Power, nothing. Stick shift, but he is an architect who restores old houses. So he needed something with all-wheel drive and towing capabilities, and obviously a family vehicle, so this is what he ended up with. I don't remember too much about it. I believe the underpinnings were a 4-cylinder. I remember it had a moonroof. And I remember this is really strange, because he got rid of this back when I was like 6. Okay, so I was very young. And the gauge cluster must have been extremely basic, because I'd always felt that if you had a tachometer, for example, over on the right-hand side of the gauge, that it was a bad thing. Now, let me explain. Back then, my vision was a lot worse than it is now. And I, being 4 or 5 years old, obviously saw things from a different point of view. So I couldn't tell at the time what I know now was probably a fuel gauge. So I remember asking my uncle if everything was okay, because I thought that something was wrong, just because that needle was over on the right-hand side, when these days, like I just said, it must have been something like a fuel gauge or something, because some of the more basic back in the 70s and the 80s, not every vehicle came with a tachometer. In fact, a tachometer was considered an option for a lot of cars, and that particular area of the gauge cluster, Chrysler decided to fill with a fuel gauge. People who are my age and born in the late 80s will probably remember this. A 1988 Plymouth Voyager and Grand Voyager. My mother had a Voyager. My aunt had a Grand Voyager. This particular example is a lot closer to the one my aunt had than the one my mother had. Mechanically, they were both exactly the same. Why did we have these vans? Well, actually, it was pretty much the same reason for both families. In my case, the reason my mother got that van was because of me. I was very sick when I was little, to the point of needing an oxygen equipment. So they needed something big enough, to haul all that stuff in. And at the time, something like the Honda Odyssey, which these days is at the top of the minivan game, up until the recent introduction of the Chrysler Pacifica, which I understand is doing really well. The Honda Odyssey just didn't have the size that we needed at the time. So we got this, an 88 Plymouth Voyager, and in the case of my aunt's Grand Voyager, it was a similar situation. One of my cousins was born, not long after she was born, she had a severe stroke, and that left her permanently wheelchair bound. And unfortunately, she died when she was still very young. I think she was about 15 when she died. I was still, I was very, very young. I didn't know her very long. She was very, very sick. But because of the fact that she was wheelchair bound, they needed something that could fit her wheelchair. So they got the Grand Voyager, they took out the middle bench and put in a bucket. And basically they transferred her into the seat, got her out of her wheelchair, for whenever she wanted to go somewhere. But after she died, that van remained in the family because it was still drivable until about 2000, and you'll see later on when we get to that model year what we replaced it with. Now, our Voyager, the one that we had, was it had a bit of an interesting quirk. Chrysler had a bit of a design flaw when building these vans, because ours and my aunt's both had the 3.3-liter V6 from Mitsubishi. And they designed it in such a way where the radiator for the van was too small. And as a result, any steep hill climb, and it overheated. Steep hill climb, forget it. Any minor hill climb, and ours overheated in particular. It was just incredible, because I remember we were going up to a ski resort, and we end up climbing this very steep hill. And obviously, when you're on a steep hill, you downshift to get more power and make it easier to climb. We get to the top, and we switch off the engine, and I literally say, "Does anybody hear a boiling noise?" We pop open the hood, and a steam geyser shot out from underneath. I remember we kept the hood up while my dad went in to get the room key. He came back, we'd cooled down just enough to get it into the garage without it being a serious problem, but we had to leave the hood up all night. Unfortunately, that was a bit of a design, like I said, a design flaw, a major quirk with these old vans. Now, my cousin, my uncle, in addition to being an architect, is also something of a makeshift mechanic. He doesn't make any money off of it. It's just a pastime, along with my cousin, his son. And because of their combined mechanical skill, My aunt's Grand Voyager managed to last a lot longer because they managed to rebuild the engine 3 times before it finally gave up the ghost. In the case of ours, we only rebuilt the engine once. They didn't bother to reset the engine computer properly, and that just made things a lot worse. By the time we got rid of ours, it literally started making a brand new noise, and it was already making about half a dozen other noises. And it literally started making a brand new noise the day we took it over to the dealership to trade it in on a 2004 Toyota Highlander. But it literally started making a new noise. We get it over to the dealership. They take a look at it. And what do they find? 116,000 miles. The interior is falling apart. The cassette deck was working, but the radio was not. The AC was dead because a belt was about to snap. It literally, if you turned on the AC, it sounded like screeching tires. So that's how bad off it was. And because of that, they only gave us $100. I don't know. One of two things happened to that van. Either somebody managed to rescue it who was mechanically inclined and did a major rebuild and overhaul, or it went to the scrapyard. So I'm not sure. As I understand it, a lot of vans of this generation ended up in the scrapyard. But before we go on to our next vehicle, I just wanted to say something. I do have very fond memories of this van. I grew up in this van. I remember we kept it clear through my freshman year in high school. And I remember one morning we pulled into the parking lot and it literally stalled. And my mom said, "You guys are just going to have to walk because there's no way I'm getting this restarted." Thankfully, one of my classmates, who was also mechanically inclined, noticed that my mom was having problems, and he came over to take a look, and I can't remember exactly what was going on. She basically, as soon as she managed to get it up and running, she left the school and went straight to the mechanic, and she said that as she was idling, and she had it up at about 2,000 or 3,000 RPM just to keep the engine from stalling out, she said there was a great big billow of black smoke coming out of the exhaust pipe. So, yeah, that van was just about ready to But that van, it's tons of room, very easy to accommodate. And the really cool thing was, because of the bench seats in the back, I remember we took a lot of road trips in that van, and I remember being able to literally lay down and go to sleep. I did that a lot. Lay down and go to sleep during the trip. I mean, as long as we didn't pack too much, there was a lot of room. And these days, that's still a selling point of many minivans. Lots of room, lots of luxuries. The 2018 Honda Odyssey and Chrysler Pacifica both are getting very good marks. I'm very interested to see how Toyota is going to respond with their Sienna. But there's this image problem with the minivan. Granted, when I was still a kid, everybody who basically bought one of these was a family, and more than often than not, the mother was the one driving it. But in all honesty, I think that a minivan is a great vehicle. Like, for instance, if you happen to have a lot of friends who you like to haul around, no better vehicle to utilize. In fact, I watch a Japanese auto exporter, and a lot of the vehicles that he exports are vehicles that are similar to these minivans. Over in Japan, they call them MPVs, multi-purpose vehicles. But they are very similar in design and accommodation to these minivans. And you see a lot more of their minivan type vehicles in Japan than you do the SUVs. And I'm thinking to myself, yes, an SUV has accommodation, but I don't know, maybe it's just because I grew up in one, but if I had to choose, I would honestly buy a minivan. And I am not ashamed to admit it. There are a lot of guys in particular, the macho guys will be like, "Oh my god, a minivan is so sissy. If people see you driving around in one, they know that you've been domesticated, etc., etc., etc." I don't feel that way personally. I don't. So, on to the next vehicle. A 1988 Oldsmobile Forenza. This was the same generation as the original Chevrolet Cavalier. Now, my late uncle, bought this, and I remember when my grandfather was still around on my mother's side, who was the local minister at the Baptist church. I remember going to church every Sunday in this little car. It had a really interesting quirk with the engine computer where the engine would idle at about 2,000 RPM for about 5 minutes before cooling down to operating temperature. But here's the most interesting thing about this vehicle from my memory. So my uncle buys this, and he has it painted, and I'm not making this up, bright tangerine orange. And my grandmother absolutely hated it. And he parked it in front of the house in clear view, in my grandmother's line of sight on purpose. And it's like, wow, bright orange. Really? But no, he kept that. How long did he keep it? He kept it till about 1996 or 97. They were on their way back from my other uncle's house, who lived about an hour away from them, and one of the cylinders blew out. It had a 4-cylinder, and it ended up becoming a 3. And you'll see the vehicle that he replaced that with a little later on. But no, the thing that stuck out about this vehicle to me was bright orange paint. So the other uncle, the one who my late uncle was going to see when the old Sforenza went and decided to give up one of its cylinders, he had a 1990 Dodge Shadow Coupe. And the one thing I remember about this vehicle was it looks like a coupe, but it's actually a hatchback. That's one of the things. The other is that it basically had no brakes. And what I mean by that is, yes, it had brakes, but if you tried to put on the emergency brake in particular, if you're trying to park on a hill, it just wouldn't hold. I'm not sure what the problem was, but it wouldn't hold. And I think it also had the same overheating problem as my mother's '88 Voyager. But it was a very simple little car. It had crank windows. I don't think it had cruise control. It had a cassette stereo. Like I said, it wasn't much. I mean, it got you from A to B, and it was cheap. And that's what he was looking for at the time. And it was this exact shade of blue, in case anybody's wondering.
12 o'clock a.m.
My father, this is honestly one of the favorite cars of the family. A 1990 Nissan Maxima GXE. My father had this. It had the V6, power everything, air conditioning, cassette stereo. That car lasted us 22 years. My dad bought it off of a guy who bought it off of a rental facility, and it came with everything, both keys, books. The only problem we had with it when we first got it was the number 4 setting on the air conditioner. It went from off to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The number 4 setting on the AC didn't work, which, to be honest, was fine with us. We felt the 3 was plenty. These days, it would be classified as a compact car. But like I said, that car kept us going for 22 years. And in fact, still ran when we got rid of it. The reason we had to get rid of it was because it needed a new cylinder. Like I said, it had the V6. It ended up becoming a V5 for a while. So it needed a new cylinder, and the cost to get that cylinder was in excess of the vehicle's worth. So we basically traded it in, and I'll never forget the day we turned it in, because we were leaving in the new car, 2012 Nissan Sentra that we still have, and a whole, half of the sales staff were gathered around this thing. One of the other reasons we did so well with it was because it had very low mileage for what it was. It was a 1990 Nissan Maxima with 65,000 miles on it. So, I mean, if somebody mechanically inclined got a hold of it and managed to make the necessary repairs, it could very well still be out there on the road today. I don't know. Now, one of the reasons I don't know is because I'm almost positive that if a teenager got a hold of this, they basically undid whatever dignity and professional and sophistication that Dad had on it, because he bought it used, like I said, but he didn't make any alterations to it. He just bought it as is. Chances are a teenager bought it and put magnesium wheels on it, lowered the ride height, what have you, made a louder exhaust, to the point where you probably wouldn't be able to recognize it these days, or I wouldn't. One of the other things that happened to it was just before we got rid of it, on the stereo, the volume knob came off. And I also had a cassette to CD adapter that I used with my portable CD player because we didn't want to put in a new stereo in the Maxima. Part of the problem was that it made the stereo think there was a cassette in it when there wasn't. I don't know how that happened. But no, we had this car for a long time. I remember going to my junior prom in this car. Dad was transportation. Just a lot of fun memories with it. My brother learned how to drive in this car. I took some driving lessons in this car, but unfortunately it was determined that my vision was not at the time adequate to drive even under restricted conditions. And these days, even if it is, with the cataract in the glasses, the cataract surgery, IOL implant in the glasses, I don't even know if I'd want to drive, to be honest, because of how crazy the roads are. So 1990 Nissan Maxima. My uncle that had the 1985 Jeep Cherokee replaced it with a 1991 Ford Explorer. That lasted about 6 years. And like I told you, he was an architect. He did a lot of driving, a lot of hauling. His vehicles don't last long because where we live up at our summer house, it's in a rural area and there's a lot of distance between A and B. So any vehicle that he has, the miles are going to be eaten up quick. So 1991 Ford Explorer. The one thing that stuck out to me about this vehicle was that the stereo ate a cassette and never worked right since. Excuse me. He replaced the 91 Explorer with a 97, and that was just a minor refresh. So that's why I didn't include it in this collection of images, because it was just a minor refresh on the front and the back, different wheels, that sort of thing. Other than that, it was basically the same vehicle, maybe some interior refresh. That second Explorer lasted him literally 400,000 miles before the engine seized up. He replaced that with a green Toyota Highlander, and that ended up going through an engine rebuild and then finally gave up the ghost, and now he has a Jeep Patriot. So, like I said, cars with him don't last long. So 1991 Ford Explorer. My late uncle on my mother's side of the family, the one who had the Oldsmobile Forenza, this is what he replaced it with, a 1994 Honda Accord DX. Now the one that's in the photo here is the LX. The DX was absolutely basic. These days you can't even get an Accord DX. In fact, I don't think they sell the DX trim level with anything these days. The DX was absolute bottom of the barrel. You wanted the Honda reliability, but you wanted it to be cheap. And when I say cheap, I mean cheap. Crank windows, no cruise control. And this particular Accord, unfortunately, was a lemon. And I can't remember, I wasn't around for the various repairs, but it was in the shop quite a few times. He ended up giving it up eventually for a 2005 Nissan Altima. He wanted another Accord, but the Honda dealer wouldn't give him enough money for it to make it affordable for him. But I remember very, very fond memories. We went to all kinds of places in that car. I also got sick in the back of that car. Basically, I ended up eating some nachos that disagreed with me, and on the way home, I, shall we say, ruined his floor mats. But, our family was very kind, very forgiving, so, he never held it against me. And that Accord did last. I mean, yes, it ended up in the shop, so we honestly considered it a lemon, but to be honest, compared to that old Oldsmobile he had, this was a lot more reliable by comparison. My uncle, who had the 1990 Dodge Shadow, replaced it with a 1995 Dodge Ram. Now, that vehicle, a couple of things about it. First of all, the mileage sucked. The thing had a V8, and he had a 60-mile commute back and forth, and it literally got 13 miles to the gallon. He hauled a lot of audio equipment in the back, and on one of my trips out to see him, my mom found a painting that she wanted, and we got that painting, and what we did was we hauled it back in the bed of my uncle's truck, and he had it mailed out to our house because we wouldn't be able to take it back on the plane. So yeah, it was a nice it was a nice truck. Although he was glad to get rid of it. It had like 124,000 miles on it when he got rid of it. And I think he was glad to get rid of it because, like I told you, the mileage absolutely sucked. He replaced it with a 2004 CRV, and now he's got a 2012 CRV. Based on the overall success of my uncle's Civic, like I told you, they considered it a lemon, but that was only because towards the end it went into the shop. Originally, because of its high reliability, my aunt decided to get a 1997 Chevrolet or Honda Civic that replaced an old Chevrolet Beretta, which I didn't include in the photos here because if I did, that was going to be too much. In fact, I'll bet this video is already 20 minutes as it is. That particular Honda was trouble-free, and so too have been the two CRVs. It was a two-door coupe, and it wasn't. It was nicer than the Dodge Shadow, but it was average. It did have cruise control, cassette stereo. At least I think it was a cassette stereo. Power windows, power locks, that sort of thing. And I was still young enough to be able to fit in the back. So yeah, that was basically, like I said, it was trouble-free. My aunt gave it to her mom because she knew that her mom, wasn't going to drive it very far, and the car couldn't. It was still usable, but you wouldn't want to use it every day. It was getting to that point. The final vehicle of memory that I have on this list is a 2000 Chrysler PT Cruiser. My aunt, who had the 1988 Plymouth Grand Voyager, replaced it with a PT Cruiser, a bright red one. We actually rented a PT Cruiser in 2009, and my brother loved that thing. And the one that my aunt had was the Limited, so it had a CD cassette stereo, moonroof, leather seating, engine block heater, the works. And in relation to that moonroof, she had a golden retriever at the time who always liked to poke her head out the roof. This dog, she would poke her head out of the roof and always look around to see where my aunt was going. And I've also ridden in the car a few times. It was a good car. It lasted them 15 years. So, it was a fun car too because just of the way that it looked. I remember back when I saw that, I told myself I was going to get one of those. Interestingly enough, the PT Cruiser only lasted about 10 years. Not long after our 2009 rental, I think a couple years later they killed it off. Which makes sense because if you're going to do something iconic, there's only so much you can do with it without ruining it. And I still see quite a few Cruisers on the road. Not as many as I used to, obviously when it was still in production, but there are still a few. So those are the cars that I grew up with. What do you think? Comments and questions are welcome. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.